The silence that followed Robert Sterling's words will haunt me forever. We were sitting around his mahogany dining table in the West Hills, crystal glasses catching the light from his imported chandelier, when he looked directly at me and said, "Sophia, honey, I know you mean well, but you're just cheap. It's cultural, I suppose." The fork in my hand trembled slightly, but I didn't drop it. I didn't cry. I didn't even speak. Because what Robert didn't know was that in exactly 6 days, I would become the majority owner of Sterling Industries, the company he'd spent 37 years building. And in that moment of humiliation, surrounded by his family's uncomfortable silence, I realized it was finally time to show him exactly what this cheap Mexican girl was really worth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sofia Elena Martinez, and for the past 4 years, I've been living a double life. To my husband David's family, I'm the woman who married above her station, the girl from East Portland who somehow convinced their golden boy to settle for less. To my coworkers at Sterling Industries, I'm the quiet engineer in the corner office who keeps her head down and does solid work. But the truth is so much more complicated than either of those versions, and it starts with understanding exactly how I ended up in that dining room, fork trembling, while my father-in-law casually destroyed my dignity over dessert. I met David Sterling 3 years ago at a renewable energy conference in Seattle. I was there representing the small consulting firm where I worked, presenting a paper on sustainable HVAC integration in industrial settings. He was there because his father had sent him to learn about all this green nonsense, as Robert liked to call it. David found my presentation afterward, introduced himself with genuine curiosity about the technology, and we ended up talking for hours over coffee that turned into dinner, that turned into a connection I hadn't expected to find. David was different from his family in ways that weren't immediately obvious. He had their height, their strong jawline, their easy confidence. But where they saw the world in terms of status and acquisition, he saw possibilities for improvement. He genuinely cared about making Sterling Industries more efficient and more environmentally responsible. He respected my expertise in ways his father never would. When he looked at me, he didn't see someone from the wrong side of town. He saw an engineer with innovative ideas and a work ethic that matched his own. We married 18 months later in a ceremony that perfectly illustrated the fault lines that would define our relationship with his family. My side of the church was filled with teachers, mechanics, nurses, small business owners, and extended family who had driven up from California to celebrate. We brought homemade food, mariachi music, and the kind of joy that comes from people who understand what it means to work for everything you have. David's side brought designer dresses, expensive gifts, and a polite distance that felt like judgment, wrapped in good manners. Robert Sterling made exactly 3 attempts at conversation with my family that day. He asked my father what he did for a living, nodded politely when Dad explained that he managed a warehouse for a food distribution company, then spent the rest of the reception talking to his country club friends about golf handicaps and stock portfolios. My mother, who had spent weeks perfecting her English pronunciation because she wanted to make a good impression, barely got 2 sentences in before Robert's attention wandered to someone more interesting. But I didn't marry Robert Sterling. I married his son, and David made it clear from the beginning that he saw our marriage as a partnership between equals. When Sterling Industries offered me a position 6 months after our wedding, it felt like an opportunity to prove myself in the family business, to show that I belonged not just as David's wife, but as a valuable contributor to their success. Sterling Industries occupied a sprawling complex in southeast Portland's industrial district, the kind of utilitarian buildings that house the machinery and expertise that keep the city running. Robert had built the company from nothing, starting as a one-man HVAC repair service in 1987 and growing it into a regional leader in commercial heating, cooling, and industrial refrigeration systems. It was genuinely impressive what he'd accomplished, building relationships with major clients throughout Oregon and Washington, maintaining contracts with hospitals, hotels, manufacturing plants, and office complexes that depended on his systems to function. What wasn't impressive was how he ran the day-to-day operations. Robert was a salesman at heart, brilliant at landing big contracts and maintaining client relationships, but he had never adapted to the technical innovations that were revolutionizing the industry. While competitors were integrating smart building technology, energy-efficient systems, and remote monitoring capabilities, Sterling Industries was still installing the same basic equipment they'd been using for 15 years. I saw the problems immediately. Our installation costs were 20% higher than they needed to be because we were using inefficient processes. Our maintenance contracts were losing money because we weren't leveraging predictive analytics to prevent problems before they became expensive emergencies. Our employee turnover was brutal because the installation crews were frustrated with outdated equipment and procedures that made their jobs harder than necessary. Most importantly, we were losing major contracts to smaller, more innovative competitors who could offer clients better value through modern technology integration. I spent my first month at Sterling Industries analyzing our lost bids and discovered a pattern that should have terrified Robert. We were being undercut not just on price, but on capability. Clients wanted smart systems that could optimize energy usage, provide real-time performance data, and integrate with building management software. We were still selling them systems that required manual monitoring and reactive maintenance. I drafted a comprehensive modernization proposal that outlined exactly how we could upgrade our capabilities, reduce costs, and win back market share. The plan was detailed, technically sound, and conservatively projected a 40% increase in profitability within 2 years. I presented it to Robert in his corner office, complete with industry research, competitor analysis, and implementation timelines. He listened politely, nodded in appropriate places, and thanked me for my thorough work. Then he filed it away and never mentioned it again. 3 months later, during a family dinner, I overheard him telling David that the company was struggling with increased competition, but that these things were cyclical and would eventually sort themselves out. That was my first real glimpse into the fundamental disconnect between Robert's self-image and reality. He saw himself as a successful businessman who had built something impressive through hard work and smart decision-making. He wasn't wrong about the hard work, but he couldn't see that the industry had evolved beyond his expertise. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He was like a master craftsman who had perfected techniques that were becoming obsolete, too proud to admit that newer methods might be superior. The pattern repeated itself over the following months. I would identify problems, develop solutions, present them professionally, and watch them disappear into Robert's filing system. Meanwhile, he would complain about challenges that my proposals directly addressed, as if the solutions hadn't been sitting on his desk for weeks. It wasn't just about business efficiency. Our employee satisfaction surveys showed that installation crews felt undervalued and unsupported. Turnover in the field service department was approaching 60% annually, which meant we were constantly training new technicians who left for better opportunities as soon as they gained experience. I suggested implementing a mentorship program, updating our training materials, and providing better tools and equipment to improve job satisfaction and retention. Robert's response was to offer a company barbecue and assume that would solve morale problems. The breaking point came during a client meeting with Pacific Northwest Medical Center, one of our largest accounts. Their facilities manager was frustrated because our maintenance response times had been declining, and they were considering switching to a competitor who offered remote monitoring and predictive maintenance capabilities. I sat in that meeting knowing that we could provide exactly what they needed if we implemented the technology upgrades I'd been proposing for months. After the client left, Robert turned to me and said, "Sofia, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but you need to understand that this business is about relationships, not gadgets. We've been serving Pacific Northwest Medical for 12 years. They're not going anywhere." 2 weeks later, they canceled their contract. That evening, David found me in our small kitchen in Selwood, staring at a glass of wine and trying to process the frustration that had been building for months. Our house was a modest 1920s craftsman that we'd bought together. Nothing fancy but warm and comfortable, with built-in bookcases and hardwood floors that creaked in familiar places. It was the kind of home that felt like sanctuary after long days dealing with Robert's dismissive management style. "You're thinking about Pacific Northwest Medical," David said, settling into the chair across from me. He knew me well enough to read the specific quality of my silence. "I'm thinking about patterns," I replied. "Your father has lost 3 major contracts in the past 6 months. I've presented solutions for every problem that caused those losses. And he continues to operate like it's 1995. David was quiet for a moment. He worked in sales for Sterling Industries, so he saw the client relationships from a different angle, but he wasn't blind to his father's limitations. "He built something impressive from nothing, Sofia. That kind of success can make it hard to accept that your methods might need updating." "I respect what he built," I said, "but respecting the past doesn't mean ignoring the future. And it definitely doesn't mean dismissing valid solutions because they come from someone he doesn't see as qualified to have them." That was the heart of it, really. Robert didn't dismiss my ideas because they were bad. He dismissed them because, in his mind, I wasn't the kind of person who should be having them. I was David's wife, the girl from the wrong side of town who should be grateful for the opportunity to work at his company, not the engineer with 15 years of experience who might actually know how to solve his problems. The final insult came 3 weeks later during what should have been a celebration. It was my birthday, and David had arranged for dinner at his parents' house, a sprawling modern home in the West Hills with floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased panoramic views of the city. Patricia Sterling had prepared her usual elaborate meal, the kind of precisely arranged dishes that looked like magazine photos and required multiple courses and specific utensils for each stage. I had dressed carefully for the occasion, choosing a navy blue dress that was professional but not too formal, expensive enough to avoid looking cheap, but not so expensive that it would seem like I was trying too hard. These calculations had become second nature after 4 years of navigating the Sterling family's unspoken expectations about appearance and behavior. The conversation during dinner was typical for these gatherings. Updates about David's sister Jennifer, who was finishing her MBA at Northwestern. Discussion of Robert's latest golf tournament results. Patricia's volunteer work with the Children's Hospital Auxiliary. I contributed when asked direct questions but mostly listened, having learned that my perspectives on most topics weren't particularly welcome. Everything changed when David mentioned that I had been selected to present at the International HVAC and Refrigeration Expo in Las Vegas, a significant professional honor that recognized my expertise in sustainable building systems. He was proud of the recognition, and I was excited about the opportunity to share research I'd been developing on energy-efficient industrial cooling applications. "That's wonderful, dear," Patricia said with the kind of smile that was perfectly polite and completely empty. "Will the company be paying for your travel expenses?" "Actually," I replied, "I'm covering my own expenses. The presentation fee will more than cover the costs, and it's important for my professional development." That's when Robert Sterling looked up from his dessert and delivered the words that changed everything. "Sofia, honey, I know you mean well, but you're just cheap. It's cultural, I suppose. You grew up thinking that spending money was somehow wrong, so you pinch pennies even when it doesn't make sense. David could easily cover those expenses, or the company could. But you insist on doing things the hard way because that's what feels familiar to you." The silence that followed was deafening. David's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Patricia suddenly became very interested in rearranging her napkin. Jennifer, who had been checking her phone, looked up with the expression of someone who had just witnessed a car accident. "What I mean," Robert continued, apparently unaware of the impact of his words, is that there's a difference between being frugal and being cheap. Frugal is smart. Cheap is, well, it's limiting. It keeps you thinking small when you could be thinking big. I sat there, my birthday dinner turning to ash in my mouth, trying to process what had just happened. Robert Sterling, who had dismissed every innovative idea I'd presented, who had ignored solutions that could have saved his company hundreds of thousands of dollars, who had lost major contracts because he was too proud to admit that his methods needed updating, was calling me cheap. Not frugal, not careful with money, cheap. And he was attributing it to my culture, as if being Mexican somehow made me incapable of understanding the value of strategic investment. The worst part wasn't even the insult itself. It was the casual way he delivered it, as if he were pointing out that my shoes didn't match my purse. There was no malice in his voice, no apparent awareness that he had just reduced my character to a stereotype and dismissed my professional judgment as a cultural limitation. He genuinely believed he was offering helpful insight into my psychological makeup. David finally found his voice. "Dad, that's not appropriate." "What's inappropriate about it?" Robert replied. "I'm trying to help her understand that she doesn't have to live like she's still struggling. She's part of this family now. She can afford to think bigger." I could have exploded. I could have listed every cost-saving measure I'd proposed that he'd ignored. I could have detailed the revenue his company had lost while he dismissed my cheap ideas. I could have pointed out that my careful financial planning had allowed me to pursue professional opportunities without depending on anyone else's generosity. Instead, I set down my fork, looked directly at him, and said, "Thank you for the feedback, Robert. I'll take it under consideration." Then I excused myself to use the restroom and spent 5 minutes staring at myself in Patricia's marble-countered powder room, hands gripping the sink edge, breathing slowly and steadily while I processed the rage that was threatening to consume me from the inside out. When I returned to the table, the conversation had moved on to safer topics. Robert was telling a story about a difficult client, displaying the same charm and confidence that had built Sterling Industries into a successful company. Patricia was laughing at appropriate moments. David was trying to catch my eye, his expression apologetic and concerned. I finished my dinner, participated in polite conversation about neutral topics, thanked them for the lovely meal, and maintained perfect composure until David and I were in our car driving home through the quiet streets of Portland. "Sofia, I'm so sorry," David began. He was completely out of line. I should have said something stronger. "It's not your fault," I replied, and I meant it. David couldn't control his father's behavior, and he had tried to defend me within the bounds of family dynamics that were complicated and long established. But it is my responsibility to make sure you're treated with respect in my family. I was quiet for several minutes, watching the city lights blur past our windows. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady and calm. "David, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Do you think I'm cheap?" He pulled into our driveway and turned off the engine before answering. "I think you're thoughtful about money in ways that my family doesn't understand. You invest in things that matter to you, and you don't waste money on things that don't. That's not cheap. That's intelligent. And do you think my professional judgment is limited by my cultural background? Your professional judgment is the reason Sterling Industries should be doing twice as much business as it currently is. Dad's too stubborn to admit that the industry has changed, but that doesn't mean he's right." I nodded, feeling some of the tension in my chest begin to loosen. David saw me clearly, even if his father didn't. That mattered more than I could express. That night, I lay awake thinking about patterns and pride, and the difference between being dismissed and being underestimated. Robert Sterling thought he understood me, but he had no idea what he was really dealing with. He saw a cheap Mexican girl who had married above her station. He had no clue that he was looking at someone who had been quietly preparing for this moment her entire adult life. Because there was something Robert didn't know about me, something that would change everything about the power dynamics in his family and his company, something that had been waiting patiently for the right moment to reveal itself. My uncle Carlos Martinez had died 2 years before I met David, but his influence on my life had been profound and lasting. Uncle Carlos was my father's older brother, the family member who had made it big in ways that the rest of us barely understood. While my father managed a warehouse and my mother taught elementary school, Uncle Carlos had built a successful investment firm in Los Angeles, accumulating wealth through careful analysis and strategic risk-taking. But Uncle Carlos had also been deeply committed to family and to lifting up the next generation. When I graduated from Oregon State with my engineering degree, he had taken me aside and explained that he was establishing a trust fund that would become available to me when I turned 30. The money was intended to give me freedom to make choices based on my values rather than my financial limitations, to pursue opportunities that might not be immediately profitable, but could lead to meaningful impact. I had turned 31 3 months ago. The trust fund was now fully accessible, containing assets worth approximately $12 million in diversified investments. But that wasn't the surprise that was waiting for Robert Sterling. The real surprise was what Uncle Carlos had been doing with his investment money over the past 15 years. My uncle had a particular interest in small and medium-sized businesses that showed potential for growth, but lacked the capital or expertise to realize that potential. He invested carefully, quietly, and strategically, often taking significant ownership stakes in companies that most people had never heard of. Companies like Sterling Industries. According to the documents my uncle's lawyer had given me 6 months ago, Uncle Carlos had been quietly acquiring Sterling Industries stock since 2018, purchasing shares from early investors who wanted to cash out, from former employees who had been given equity as part of compensation packages, and from Robert himself during a cash flow crisis in 2020 that David's family had never mentioned to me. Uncle Carlos now owned, through various holding companies and investment vehicles, approximately 68% of Sterling Industries. And according to the terms of his will, that ownership had transferred to me upon his death, held in trust until my 31st birthday. Which meant that as of 3 months ago, I had become the majority owner of the company where Robert Sterling had just called me cheap. The morning after Robert's dinner table humiliation, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. David had already left for an early client meeting, and I sat in our quiet kitchen with my coffee, finally ready to confront the full scope of what Uncle Carlos had left me. The manila envelope from his lawyer had been sitting in my home office, safe for 6 months, and I had been too emotionally conflicted to fully process its contents. Now, with Robert's words still echoing in my head, I was ready to understand exactly what kind of power I actually held. Uncle Carlos Martinez had been the family success story that everyone whispered about, but nobody fully understood. While the rest of us lived comfortable but modest lives in working-class neighborhoods, Carlos had somehow transformed himself into a wealthy investor whose business acumen was legendary among the small circle of people who knew him personally. My earliest memories of him involved visits to our cramped apartment in East Portland, where he would arrive in expensive suits and luxury cars that seemed impossibly out of place in our neighborhood. But Carlos never acted like his success made him superior to the rest of us. He would sit at our kitchen table eating my mother's homemade tamales, speaking Spanish with my grandparents, and asking detailed questions about my schoolwork as if my elementary school achievements were the most important thing in his world. He had a way of making every person in the room feel like their dreams mattered, regardless of how impossible those dreams might seem given our circumstances. What I didn't understand as a child was that Carlos was studying us, learning about our individual personalities and potential, quietly making investments in our futures that wouldn't become apparent for years. He paid for my cousin Maria's nursing school tuition. He helped my brother Luis start his auto repair business. He created scholarship funds at local high schools that supported first-generation college students. He was building a network of family members and community connections who would eventually become successful in their own right, though none of us realized we were part of his larger strategy. My relationship with Carlos deepened when I entered high school and began showing serious aptitude for mathematics and science. While my parents were proud of my academic achievements, they didn't have the background to guide me toward opportunities that could maximize my potential. Carlos stepped in, not as a benefactor, but as a mentor who understood how to navigate systems that were designed to advantage people who already had connections and resources. He helped me identify the best engineering programs at Oregon universities. He explained how financial aid applications worked and connected me with scholarship opportunities that I never would have discovered on my own. He introduced me to successful engineers and business owners who could provide internships and professional guidance. Most importantly, he taught me how to think strategically about long-term goals and the steps required to achieve them. During my junior year of college, Carlos began sharing more details about his investment philosophy and business approach. He explained that his success came from identifying undervalued assets and understanding market dynamics that other investors overlooked. He had started with small real estate investments in Los Angeles, purchasing properties in neighborhoods that were beginning to show signs of gentrification, but hadn't yet attracted major developer attention. From real estate, he had expanded into small business investments, targeting companies that had solid fundamentals but lacked the capital or expertise to grow efficiently. His approach was patient and strategic. He would spend months researching a potential investment, analyzing market conditions, studying the competition, and getting to know the people involved before making any financial commitments. Once he invested, he took an active interest in the business, providing guidance and resources that went far beyond simple financial backing. What made Carlos particularly successful was his ability to see potential that other investors missed. He invested in companies owned by women and minorities who were systematically undervalued by traditional financial institutions. He supported businesses in emerging industries that established investors considered too risky or too small to be worth their attention. He understood that patience and careful analysis could generate returns that were impossible to achieve through conventional investment strategies. By the time I graduated from Oregon State, Carlos had built a portfolio worth several $100 million, but he lived modestly and gave away substantial amounts to educational and community organizations. He never flaunted his wealth or used it to gain social status. Instead, he viewed money as a tool for creating opportunities, both for himself and for other people who shared his values and work ethic. The conversation that changed my understanding of my own future happened during my final semester of college. Carlos invited me to spend a weekend at his home in Los Angeles, a surprisingly modest house in a middle-class neighborhood that gave no external indication of his financial success. We spent Saturday morning walking through his neighborhood, discussing my career plans and his observations about the engineering industry. "Sofia," he said as we stopped at a local park where children were playing on old but well-maintained equipment. "I want to talk to you about something important. You're going to graduate in a few months with excellent grades and strong technical skills. You'll find a good job, work hard, and build a successful career. But I want you to think bigger than that." He explained that he had been watching my development throughout college, not just academically but professionally and personally. He had seen how I approached problems, how I interacted with classmates and professors, how I balanced competing priorities and maintained my values even when it would have been easier to compromise them. Based on those observations, he believed I had the potential to make significant contributions not just as an engineer, but as a leader and decision-maker. "The engineering skills will get you in the door," he said. "But your ability to see systems clearly, to understand how different pieces fit together, to work with people who have different backgrounds and perspectives, those are the abilities that will allow you to create real change. And creating real change requires resources." That's when he told me about the trust fund he was establishing. The money would become available when I turned 30, with the specific intention of giving me the financial freedom to make career and life choices based on opportunity and impact, rather than immediate financial necessity. He wanted me to have the luxury of taking risks, of pursuing projects that might not be immediately profitable, but could lead to meaningful professional growth. More importantly, he wanted me to understand that wealth was not an end in itself, but a means of expanding the range of problems I could solve and the number of people I could help. He had seen too many talented people from our community limit their ambitions because they couldn't afford to take strategic risks, or because they didn't have access to the networks and resources that would allow their ideas to flourish. The trust fund was structured to provide me with complete control over the assets, but Carlos had also included detailed documentation of his investment philosophy and strategies. He wanted me to understand not just what he was giving me, but how he had created it and how it could be used most effectively. The real education was in learning to think like an investor and a strategic planner, not just like someone who had inherited money. What Carlos didn't tell me during that conversation was that he had already begun making investments that would directly impact my future career. While I was finishing my engineering degree and preparing to enter the workforce, he was quietly researching companies in the Pacific Northwest that aligned with my professional interests and showed potential for growth under better management. Sterling Industries had caught his attention in 2018, not because of its current performance, but because of its market position and the opportunities that Robert Sterling was failing to recognize or capitalize on. Carlos saw a profitable company with strong client relationships and solid technical capabilities that was being held back by outdated management practices and resistance to innovation. It was exactly the kind of investment opportunity that he found most appealing. A business with excellent potential that was undervalued because its current leadership couldn't see or act on that potential. Carlos began acquiring Sterling Industries stock slowly and strategically, purchasing shares from early investors who wanted to liquidate their holdings, from former employees who had received equity as part of compensation packages, and from Robert himself during a financial crisis in 2020 that the Sterling family had carefully kept private. Each purchase was small enough to avoid attracting attention, but collectively they gave Carlos significant influence over the company's direction. By 2021, Carlos owned controlling interest in Sterling Industries, though he had never made his ownership public or attempted to influence company operations. He was waiting for the right moment and the right person to implement the changes that would unlock the company's full potential. He was waiting for me to finish my education, gain professional experience, and develop the confidence and expertise that would be necessary to transform a traditional manufacturing company into a modern, innovative industry leader. Uncle Carlos died suddenly in early 2022, just as I was beginning to establish myself professionally and personally. His death was devastating, not just because I loved him, but because I felt like I was losing my most important mentor and advisor at a crucial stage of my career development. The grief was complicated by the knowledge that he had been planning to share more of his business insights with me, to gradually transition some of his investment responsibilities to me as part of my ongoing education. The meeting with his lawyer, Patricia Chen, took place 6 weeks after the funeral, in a downtown Portland office that overlooked the Willamette River. Patricia was an elegant woman in her 50s who had worked closely with Carlos for over a decade, managing the legal aspects of his investments and ensuring that his various business interests remained properly organized and compliant with regulatory requirements. Patricia explained that Carlos had updated his will several times during his final years, each revision reflecting his evolving understanding of my potential and his confidence in my ability to manage significant financial responsibilities. The final version, completed just 3 months before his death, transferred the majority of his assets to the trust fund he had established for me, with specific instructions about how and when those assets should become available. The documentation Patricia provided was overwhelming in its scope and detail. Carlos had created comprehensive profiles of every investment in his portfolio, including detailed financial analysis, market research, strategic recommendations, and his personal observations about the management and potential of each company. He had essentially created a graduate-level business education program specifically tailored to my interests and career goals. The Sterling Industries file was the most extensive of all his investment documents. Carlos had been studying the company for over 4 years, analyzing everything from their financial statements and client contracts to their employee satisfaction surveys and industry reputation. His notes revealed a deep understanding of the company's strengths and weaknesses, as well as specific recommendations for operational improvements that could dramatically increase profitability and market share. According to Carlos's analysis, Sterling Industries was generating approximately 60% of its potential revenue because of inefficient processes, outdated technology, and poor employee retention. The company had excellent relationships with major clients, solid technical capabilities, and a strong reputation for reliability, but it was consistently losing market share to smaller, more innovative competitors who offered superior value. Through modern technology integration and superior customer service, Carlos had identified exactly the same problems that I had been trying to address during my time working at Sterling Industries. His recommendations paralleled the proposals I had presented to Robert, with additional financial analysis and implementation strategies that demonstrated how these changes could be accomplished profitably and efficiently. Reading his notes was like discovering that someone else had been watching the same movie I had been watching, but with a much clearer understanding of how the story was supposed to end. The most shocking revelation was the extent of Carlos's ownership position. Through a network of holding companies and investment partnerships, he controlled approximately 68% of Sterling Industries stock, making him the decisive voice in any major company decisions. He had structured these investments carefully to avoid triggering disclosure requirements that would have revealed his identity to company management or other shareholders. Carlos's strategy had been to remain invisible until the company reached a crisis point that would force Robert Sterling to consider outside intervention, or until I was professionally and personally ready to step into a leadership role. He had been waiting for me to gain enough experience to understand the industry, develop relationships with key employees, and demonstrate my ability to identify and solve complex operational problems. In his final letter to me, included with the legal documents, Carlos wrote, "Sofia, by the time you read this, you will have had the opportunity to observe Sterling Industries from the inside and develop your own opinions about what needs to change. You will have experienced Robert Sterling's management style directly and formed your own conclusions about his ability to lead the company into the future. Trust your instincts and your analysis. You understand this business better than Robert does, and you have the resources to implement the changes that will unlock its full potential." The letter continued, "I have given you not just money, but strategic position. Use both wisely. The employees of Sterling Industries deserve leadership that recognizes their value and invests in their success. The clients deserve innovation and excellence. The community deserves a company that contributes to economic growth and environmental sustainability. You have the knowledge, resources, and authority to provide all of these things. The only question is whether you have the courage to claim that authority when the moment arrives." Reading those words 6 months ago had been overwhelming. The responsibility felt enormous, and I wasn't sure I was ready to step into the role Carlos had envisioned for me. I had been working at Sterling Industries for less than 2 years, still learning the industry and building relationships with coworkers who saw me primarily as David's wife, rather than as a business professional in my own right. But Robert's dinner table humiliation had crystallized something that had been building in my mind for months. I was tired of watching a company with enormous potential struggle because its leader was too proud to admit that his methods were outdated. I was tired of seeing talented employees leave for better opportunities because they weren't valued or supported. I was tired of being dismissed and underestimated by someone who understood far less about the business than he thought he did. Most importantly, I was tired of allowing Robert Sterling to define my value and my potential based on his prejudices and limitations. Carlos had seen something in me that Robert couldn't or wouldn't recognize, and he had given me the tools to prove him right. It was time to stop waiting for permission and start claiming the authority that was rightfully mine. The morning after the birthday dinner disaster, I called Patricia Chen and scheduled a meeting to discuss the next steps in asserting my ownership position at Sterling Industries. I had spent months learning the business from the inside, documenting problems and developing solutions, building relationships with employees who understood the need for change. I had direct experience with Robert's management style and a clear understanding of his limitations. I was ready to show Robert Sterling exactly what this cheap Mexican girl was really capable of accomplishing. The weeks following my meeting with Patricia Chen were a masterclass in strategic patience. Armed with the full knowledge of my ownership, position, and Uncle Carlos's detailed analysis of Sterling Industries, I returned to work with a completely different perspective. Instead of feeling frustrated by Robert's dismissive attitude, I began documenting every missed opportunity, every operational inefficiency, and every moment when his pride prevented the company from reaching its potential. Robert made it remarkably easy to build my case. 3 days after calling me cheap at dinner, he rejected another modernization proposal from our IT department, claiming that our current systems were perfectly adequate, despite the fact that our competitors were using cloud-based project management, software that allowed them to coordinate installations more efficiently and respond to client requests faster than we could. The IT manager, Janet Rodriguez, had prepared a comprehensive cost-benefit analysis showing that the upgrade would pay for itself within 8 months through improved productivity and reduced administrative overhead. I watched Janet present her proposal in the conference room, her preparation evident in every slide and supporting document. She had researched multiple software options, obtained quotes from vendors, and even arranged for demonstrations that would allow our project managers to test the systems before making a final decision. Her presentation was professional, thorough, and compelling. Robert listened with the distracted air of someone who had already made up his mind, occasionally checking his phone and shuffling through other paperwork while she spoke. When Janet finished, Robert leaned back in his chair and delivered his verdict with the casual dismissiveness that had become his trademark response to innovation. "Janet, I appreciate the work you've put into this, but we've been managing projects successfully for 37 years without fancy software. Our clients care about results, not technology. Let's focus on what we do well instead of chasing after every new gadget that comes along." Janet's face remained professionally neutral, but I could see the frustration in her eyes. She had spent weeks developing a solution that would directly address problems that Robert complained about regularly: miscommunications between field crews and office staff, delays in updating clients about project status, difficulty tracking inventory, and scheduling across multiple job sites. The software she was recommending would solve all of these issues while reducing administrative costs and improving customer satisfaction. After the meeting, I found Janet in her office, staring at her computer screen with the defeated expression of someone who had just watched months of careful work dismissed without serious consideration. "This happens a lot, doesn't it?" I asked, settling into the chair across from her desk. Janet looked up, seeming surprised that anyone had bothered to check on her after the meeting. "More often than I'd like to admit," she said. "I've been here for 6 years, and I've probably presented 15 different proposals for system improvements. Maybe 3 of them have been implemented, and those were only because we had client complaints that forced the issue." She pulled up a folder on her computer containing what appeared to be dozens of documents. Process improvements, technology upgrades, training programs, employee retention initiatives. I keep proposing solutions to problems that everyone acknowledges exist, but nothing ever changes. Robert doesn't trust anything he doesn't personally understand, and he doesn't want to invest time in understanding new approaches. This conversation revealed a pattern that extended far beyond technology issues. Janet had identified the same operational inefficiencies that I had been observing, but from a different angle. Where I saw engineering and technical problems, she saw information management and communication breakdowns. Where I focused on equipment and process improvements, she concentrated on workflow optimization and data integration. Together, we had a comprehensive understanding of why Sterling Industries was underperforming relative to its potential. Over the following weeks, I began having similar conversations with other employees who had been frustrated by Robert's resistance to change. Tom Chen in accounting had proposals for financial management improvements that would provide better cash flow analysis and project profitability tracking. Maria Santos in human resources had developed comprehensive plans for employee training and retention programs that would address our chronic turnover problems. Jennifer Walsh in operations had identified supply chain inefficiencies that were costing us thousands of dollars monthly in unnecessary inventory costs and delayed project completions. Each of these employees had done exactly what I had done: identified real problems, developed practical solutions, presented their recommendations professionally, and watched those recommendations disappear into Robert's filing system. They were all competent professionals who understood their areas of expertise better than Robert did, but their insights were consistently dismissed or ignored because they came from people Robert didn't view as strategic decision-makers. The pattern became even more obvious during client interactions. I started paying closer attention to how Robert handled sales meetings and client relationships, particularly when problems arose that required technical problem-solving or creative solutions. His approach was to rely on charm and relationship history, while avoiding detailed discussions of technical capabilities or innovative approaches that might differentiate us from competitors. During a particularly revealing meeting with Henderson Manufacturing, one of our largest industrial clients, their facilities manager raised concerns about energy costs associated with their current cooling system. They were facing pressure from corporate headquarters to reduce utility expenses, and they were considering proposals from competitors who offered more energy-efficient alternatives to our existing installation. I had researched this issue months earlier and knew exactly what Henderson Manufacturing needed: a retrofit that would integrate smart sensors and variable speed controls with their existing system, reducing energy consumption by approximately 30% while improving temperature control and reducing maintenance requirements. The technology was well established, cost-effective, and would pay for itself within 18 months through reduced utility bills. When the Henderson facilities manager asked about energy efficiency options, Robert responded with vague assurances about exploring possibilities and promises to look into available solutions. He made no mention of specific technologies or concrete proposals, despite the fact that I had already drafted a detailed retrofit plan that addressed their exact requirements. Instead, he shifted the conversation to Sterling Industries' long history of reliable service and our commitment to customer satisfaction. After the meeting, I approached Robert about presenting the retrofit proposal I had developed. He dismissed it immediately, claiming that Henderson Manufacturing was just fishing for discounts and would ultimately stick with Sterling Industries because of our established relationship. "They're not going anywhere, Sofia," he said with the confidence of someone who had never lost a major client to a competitor offering superior value. "Sometimes clients make noise about costs, but they know we deliver quality work on time." Henderson Manufacturing canceled their maintenance contract 6 weeks later, awarding a comprehensive retrofit and ongoing service agreement to a smaller competitor who had presented exactly the kind of energy efficiency solutions that Robert had refused to offer. The lost revenue was substantial, but more damaging was the signal it sent to other clients who were watching to see how Sterling Industries would respond to changing market demands. Robert's reaction to losing Henderson Manufacturing was to blame external factors beyond his control: unrealistic client expectations, price competition from companies that cut corners on quality, and an increasingly difficult business environment that favored flashy marketing over solid performance. He showed no recognition that Henderson Manufacturing had left because we failed to provide solutions they specifically requested, solutions that were well within our technical capabilities and would have been profitable for both companies. This became the recurring theme of my experience at Sterling Industries during those crucial weeks. Watching Robert create problems through his refusal to adapt, then attributing those problems to external forces while dismissing the internal solutions that could have prevented them entirely. It was like watching someone complain about being wet while refusing to come in out of the rain. The frustration reached its peak during our quarterly all-hands meeting, where Robert addressed the entire company about our temporary challenges in a competitive marketplace. Standing in front of nearly 200 employees, he delivered a speech about Sterling Industries' commitment to traditional values and proven methods, emphasizing our focus on reliability and customer service rather than gimmicks and gadgets that other companies use to distract from inferior workmanship. I sat in the back of the room, watching the faces of employees who knew exactly why we were losing contracts and market share. Janet Rodriguez, who had seen her technology proposals ignored repeatedly, maintained a carefully neutral expression while Robert explained that our success came from sticking to what works rather than chasing after unproven innovations. Tom Chen, whose financial analysis had identified exactly where we were hemorrhaging money, listened politely while Robert attributed our declining profitability to industry-wide pressures that were affecting all companies equally. Most tellingly, several of our most experienced field technicians exchanged glances when Robert praised our time-tested equipment and procedures. These were the employees who dealt directly with clients, who heard complaints about our slower response times and outdated diagnostic methods, who watched competitors complete installations more efficiently using modern tools and techniques that Sterling Industries refused to adopt. After the meeting, I overheard conversations that revealed the true scope of employee frustration. Senior technicians were discussing job opportunities with competitors who offered better equipment and more efficient workflows. Administrative staff were comparing our outdated systems unfavorably with companies where they had previously worked or where friends were currently employed. Project managers were expressing concern about their ability to meet client expectations, with resources that were increasingly inadequate compared to industry standards. The most damaging conversation happened between two of our best installation supervisors, Mike Patterson and Carlos Rivera, who had been with Sterling Industries for over a decade each. They were discussing a particularly difficult project where equipment failures and communication breakdowns had resulted in significant delays and cost overruns. "I'm tired of making excuses to clients for problems we could prevent," Mike was saying. "Every other company in town has diagnostic equipment that can identify potential failures before they happen. We're still using tools from 15 years ago and hoping for the best." Carlos nodded grimly. "And the project management system is a joke. I spent 3 hours yesterday trying to coordinate with the office about material deliveries because our scheduling software can't handle changes in real time. The client was asking why their installation was delayed, and I had to explain that our systems aren't sophisticated enough to track inventory efficiently. The worst part," Mike continued, "is that we all know what needs to change. Sofia Martinez has presented solutions for half these problems, and Robert just files them away and pretends everything is fine. How long are we supposed to watch this? Company fall behind while he refuses to listen to people who actually understand the work?" These conversations were happening throughout the company, and they revealed something that Robert either couldn't see or chose to ignore. His employees were ready for change and increasingly frustrated with leadership that prevented them from doing their jobs effectively. The loyalty and dedication that had sustained Sterling Industries for decades were eroding as talented people began to question whether they had a future with a company that refused to evolve. The breaking point came during what should have been a routine safety meeting. Robert had called the meeting in response to a minor accident on a job site, where a technician had been injured because of equipment malfunction. Instead of addressing the underlying issues that had contributed to the accident, outdated safety protocols, aging equipment that required more frequent maintenance, inadequate training on proper procedures, Robert used the meeting to deliver a lecture about personal responsibility and following established procedures. Accidents happen when people get careless or try to take shortcuts, he announced to the assembled field staff. We have safety procedures that have worked for 37 years. The problem isn't our systems, it's making sure everyone follows them consistently. The injured technician, Danny Morales, was sitting in the front row with his arm in a sling. The accident had occurred when a hydraulic lift malfunctioned during a routine maintenance procedure, causing him to fall and injure his shoulder. Danny was an experienced technician with an impeccable safety record who had been with Sterling Industries for 8 years. He had followed all established procedures, but the equipment failure had created a dangerous situation that current protocols didn't adequately address. As Robert continued his speech about individual responsibility, I watched Danny's face grow increasingly tense. Finally, he raised his uninjured hand and asked for permission to speak. "Mr. Sterling," Danny said, his voice carefully controlled, "I appreciate the focus on safety, but I think we need to talk about equipment maintenance and replacement schedules. The lift that failed last week had been flagged for service 3 times in the past 6 months. Each time, we were told that repairs could wait because the equipment was still functional." Robert's expression tightened. "Danny, I understand. You're frustrated about your accident, but pointing fingers doesn't solve anything. Equipment maintenance is handled according to manufacturer specifications and industry standards." "But that's exactly the problem," Danny replied, his frustration beginning to show despite his obvious effort to remain respectful. "The manufacturer specifications assume regular replacement of components that we've been deferring because of cost concerns. Other companies are using newer equipment with better safety features and more reliable performance. We're trying to maintain 30-year-old equipment to modern safety standards, and it's not working." The room had grown completely silent. Everyone present knew that Danny was right, and everyone knew that Robert hated being contradicted in public settings. The tension was palpable as Robert struggled to maintain his composure while dismissing concerns that were obviously legitimate and widely shared. "Danny, I think your injury has made you overly focused on worst-case scenarios," Robert said with the patronizing tone he reserved for employees who challenged his authority. "Sterling Industries has an excellent safety record precisely because we stick to proven procedures and don't chase after every new piece of equipment that salespeople claim is better than what we have." That response revealed everything wrong with Robert's leadership approach. Instead of acknowledging legitimate safety concerns raised by an injured employee, he dismissed those concerns as emotional overreaction. Instead of investigating whether equipment replacement might prevent future accidents, he defended the status quo by citing past performance that was increasingly irrelevant to current conditions. After the meeting, I found myself surrounded by employees who wanted to discuss what had just happened. The consensus was clear. Robert's refusal to address legitimate operational concerns was creating unsafe working conditions, inefficient processes, and an increasingly untenable business environment. People were tired of being blamed for problems that stemmed from systematic underinvestment in equipment, training, and process improvements. That evening, I sat in my home office reviewing the documentation I had been compiling over the past months. The pattern was undeniable and comprehensive. Robert Sterling was systematically preventing Sterling Industries from reaching its potential through his refusal to listen to employees, adapt to changing market conditions, or invest in improvements that would benefit clients, workers, and the company's long-term profitability. I had detailed records of rejected proposals, lost contracts, employee complaints, safety concerns, and operational inefficiencies that painted a clear picture of leadership failure. More importantly, I had solutions for every problem I had identified, solutions that were technically sound, financially viable, and enthusiastically supported by the employees who would implement them. The only thing standing between Sterling Industries and its full potential was Robert Sterling himself. And thanks to Uncle Carlos's strategic planning, I now had the authority to remove that obstacle permanently. The phone call with Patricia Chen changed everything. It was a Tuesday morning in early November, exactly 3 weeks after Danny Morales' accident and 2 months after Robert's dinner table insult. I had reached the point where documenting problems felt like enabling them to continue, and I was ready to move from observation to action. Patricia's voice was crisp and professional as she walked me through the legal procedures for asserting my ownership position, but I could hear the underlying excitement in her tone. She had been waiting for this call as long as I had been preparing to make it. Sofia, the documentation Uncle Carlos left provides you with multiple options for how to proceed, Patricia explained during our hour-long conversation. You can call a shareholders meeting to address specific operational concerns, you can exercise your majority vote to make immediate leadership changes, or you can acquire the remaining shares and take complete control of the company. Each approach has different legal requirements and timeline considerations. I had been thinking about this decision for weeks, weighing the benefits of gradual change against the necessity for comprehensive transformation. Robert's resistance to improvement wasn't limited to specific issues that could be addressed through incremental policy changes. His fundamental approach to leadership was preventing Sterling Industries from adapting to market conditions that were evolving rapidly. Half measures would only delay the inevitable confrontation while allowing more damage to accumulate. I want complete control, I told Patricia. Not just enough influence to make suggestions, but enough authority to implement changes immediately and comprehensively. How quickly can we make that happen? Patricia's response revealed the extent of Uncle Carlos's strategic planning. He had structured his stock acquisitions to facilitate exactly this kind of transition, maintaining detailed records of every transaction and ensuring that all ownership transfers were legally bulletproof. More importantly, he had identified the remaining shareholders and established preliminary agreements that would allow me to purchase their holdings at fair market value whenever I chose to exercise those options. We can complete the acquisition process within 2 weeks, Patricia said. Uncle Carlos negotiated purchase agreements with the 3 remaining significant shareholders, and those agreements are still valid. The paperwork is already prepared. We just need your signature and authorization to transfer funds from your trust account. The remaining shareholders were Robert himself, who owned 18% of the company, David, who had inherited 12% from his grandfather, and Patricia Sterling, who controlled 2% through a gift that Robert had given her years earlier. Uncle Carlos had negotiated purchase agreements with all 3 parties during the 2020 financial crisis, when Sterling Industries needed capital injection and the family was willing to sell equity to avoid taking on debt. The agreements were structured as options that could be exercised at any time, with purchase prices based on independent valuations that were updated annually. This meant that I could acquire complete ownership of Sterling Industries immediately, at prices that were fair to the sellers but reflected the company's current performance rather than its potential value under better management. More intriguingly, Patricia revealed that Robert had actually approached Uncle Carlos about selling his remaining shares as recently as 6 months ago, during a cash flow shortage that Robert had kept hidden from his family and employees. Uncle Carlos had declined the immediate purchase, but had updated the option agreement to reflect Robert's apparent willingness to divest his ownership stake if the price was right. He's been struggling financially, Patricia explained. Not the company, but Robert personally. He's overextended on some real estate investments and facing margin calls on stock positions that haven't performed as expected. He needs liquidity, and his Sterling Industries shares represent his largest available asset. This information added a new dimension to my planning. Robert's dismissive attitude toward change wasn't just about pride or stubbornness. It was also influenced by financial pressure that was affecting his decision-making in ways that weren't obvious to outside observers. His resistance to capital Investments in equipment and technology upgrades wasn't just philosophical. It was also driven by his need to maximize short-term cash flow to service personal debts. Understanding Robert's financial situation helped explain some of his recent behavior that had seemed particularly irrational. His rejection of proposals that would improve long-term profitability made more sense if he was prioritizing immediate cash generation over strategic growth. His reluctance to invest in employee retention made more sense if he was trying to minimize payroll expenses in the short term, even though high turnover was more expensive in the long run. Patricia and I spent the remainder of our conversation developing a timeline for the acquisition and transition process. The legal mechanics were straightforward: transfer funds, execute documents, file required notifications with regulatory agencies. The practical considerations were more complex, requiring careful coordination to minimize disruption to company operations and client relationships. We agreed that I would exercise the purchase options immediately, but delay announcing the ownership change until I was ready to implement comprehensive operational changes. This would give me time to prepare detailed transition plans, secure commitments from key employees, and develop communication strategies for clients, vendors, and other stakeholders who would be affected by new leadership. Most importantly, it would allow me to coordinate with David about his response to the situation. David owned 12% of Sterling Industries, which meant he would receive a substantial financial windfall from the stock purchase, but it also meant that his relationship with his father was about to become significantly more complicated. I needed to have a conversation with my husband about what was going to happen and how we were going to handle the family dynamics that would inevitably result. That conversation took place the following evening, in our living room after David returned from a particularly frustrating day dealing with client complaints about delayed project completion. He was exhausted and discouraged, having spent most of his day apologizing for problems that he couldn't solve because his father refused to authorize the operational changes that would prevent them. "David," I said, settling beside him on our couch with 2 glasses of wine, "I need to tell you something important about Sterling Industries, and I need you to hear me completely before you respond." I explained everything. Uncle Carlos's investment strategy, my ownership position, my plans for acquiring complete control of the company, and my intention to remove Robert from leadership immediately upon completing the transition. David listened without interruption, his expression shifting from confusion to surprise to something that looked like relief. When I finished, David was quiet for several long minutes, processing the implications of what I had told him. Finally, he looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. Not surprise or concern, but something that looked almost like admiration. "Sofia, I have to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. How long have you known about this?" I explained the timeline: Uncle Carlos's death, the delayed revelation of the trust fund contents, my gradual understanding of the ownership situation, and my recent decision to take action. David nodded slowly as I spoke, and I could see him, connecting recent events with information that suddenly made more sense. "That explains a lot about your behavior over the past few months," he said. "I thought you were just getting frustrated with Dad's management style, but you were actually preparing to replace him." "I was hoping it wouldn't come to that," I replied honestly. I kept thinking that maybe he would recognize the problems and be willing to make changes. But after what happened at your parents' house, after watching him dismiss legitimate safety concerns from an injured employee, after seeing how his resistance to change is damaging the company and the people who work there, I realized that hoping for gradual improvement was just enabling continued deterioration. David reached for my hand, squeezing gently. "Sofia, I want you to know that I support this completely, not just because I think you'll be a better leader than my father, although I absolutely believe that, but because Sterling Industries deserves leadership that recognizes its potential and invests in its people. Dad built something impressive, but he's lost the ability to see what it could become. We spent the next 2 hours discussing the practical implications of my decision. David would resign from Sterling Industries immediately upon my acquisition of complete ownership, both to avoid any appearance of nepotism and to pursue opportunities that aligned better with his long-term career goals. He had been considering leaving his father's company for months, frustrated by the same operational inefficiencies that had been driving my plans for change. More significantly, David supported my intention to offer Robert a dignified transition rather than an immediate termination. Despite his frustration with his father's leadership, David still loved and respected the man who had built Sterling Industries from nothing. He wanted Robert to have the opportunity to step down voluntarily and maintain his reputation in the industry, even though we both knew that voluntary retirement was unlikely given Robert's personality and financial situation. The final element of our conversation focused on family relationships and how we would handle the inevitable conflict that would result from my actions. David was prepared for his father's anger and his mother's confusion, but he was also ready to defend my decisions based on their merit rather than their impact on family harmony. "My parents are going to be furious," David said matter-of-factly. "Dad will see this as a betrayal, and Mom will see it as an attack on the family. But they'll also have to acknowledge that you're making these decisions based on legitimate business concerns and legal ownership rights. They can't argue with the facts, even if they don't like the implications." Over the following week, Patricia and I executed the stock purchase agreements with remarkable efficiency. The legal transfers were completed within 5 business days, giving me 94% ownership of Sterling Industries and complete authority to make any operational changes I deemed necessary. The remaining 6% was held by 2 longtime employees who had received small equity positions as part of retirement packages, and both had indicated their support for new leadership through informal conversations with Patricia. The financial transfers were substantial but straightforward. Robert received $8, $2 million for his 18% stake. David received $5, $4 million for his 12%, and Patricia Sterling received $900,000 for her 2% holding. All 3 transactions were based on current market valuations and represented fair compensation for their ownership positions, though none of them understood that they were selling to me rather than to Uncle Carlos's estate. With complete ownership secured, I began implementing the second phase of my plan, preparing for comprehensive operational changes that would transform Sterling Industries from a traditional manufacturing company into a modern, innovative industry leader. This required detailed planning across multiple areas simultaneously: technology upgrades, process improvements, employee training, client communication, and organizational restructuring. I worked with Janet Rodriguez to finalize specifications for the technology upgrades that had been rejected repeatedly over the past 2 years. The project management software, diagnostic equipment, inventory tracking systems, and communication platforms that she had researched would be implemented immediately upon my assumption of leadership. Janet had maintained detailed implementation timelines and training schedules, anticipating that these changes would eventually be approved once someone with authority recognized their necessity. Tom Chen and I developed comprehensive financial restructuring plans that would optimize cash flow, improve project profitability tracking, and establish performance metrics that would allow department managers to make data-driven decisions about resource allocation and strategic priorities. Tom had been frustrated for years by Robert's resistance to financial analysis that revealed uncomfortable truths about operational efficiency, and he was eager to implement systems that would provide transparency and accountability. Maria Santos prepared employee retention and development programs that would address the chronic turnover problems that had been plaguing Sterling Industries for years. Her plans included competitive compensation adjustments, professional development opportunities, improved safety training, and recognition programs that would acknowledge the contributions of employees who had been undervalued under Robert's leadership. Most importantly, I worked with Jennifer Walsh to develop operational improvements that would allow Sterling Industries to offer the innovative services and competitive pricing that had been driving clients to our competitors. Jennifer had been documenting process inefficiencies for years, developing solutions that would reduce installation times, improve quality control, and enhance customer satisfaction across all service categories. The coordination required for these simultaneous improvements was complex, but it was also energizing in ways that I hadn't experienced since joining Sterling Industries. Instead of developing proposals that would be ignored or dismissed, I was working with competent professionals who shared my vision for what the company could accomplish under effective leadership. We were solving problems that had real solutions, implementing changes that would produce measurable results, and creating an organization that would deserve the loyalty and dedication of its employees. The final element of my preparation involved developing communication strategies for the inevitable confrontation with Robert. Patricia and I rehearsed multiple scenarios for how he might respond to learning about the ownership change and leadership transition. We prepared detailed documentation of his performance failures, financial analyses showing the cost of his resistance to change, and comprehensive plans for how Sterling Industries would operate under my leadership. Most importantly, we developed a timeline that would minimize disruption to company operations and client relationships. Robert would be informed of the ownership change on a Friday afternoon, giving him the weekend to process the information before a Monday morning announcement. To employees and clients, this would allow for a clean transition while reducing the potential for immediate chaos or retaliation. By the second week of November, everything was in place. The legal documentation was complete, the operational plans were finalized, the key employees were prepared for immediate implementation of changes, and the communication strategies were rehearsed and ready. I had transformed from someone who was dismissed and underestimated into someone who held complete authority to reshape Sterling Industries according to principles that Robert had rejected for years. The only remaining step was to walk into Sterling's office and show him exactly what this cheap Mexican girl had accomplished while he wasn't paying attention. Friday afternoon at Sterling Industries typically felt like the end of a marathon. Employees were wrapping up projects, preparing for weekend breaks, and looking forward to time away from the constant pressure of deadlines and client demands. But on November 18th, as I walked through the familiar corridors toward Robert's corner office, the atmosphere felt different. There was an electricity in the air that had nothing to do with the approaching weekend and everything to do with the transformation that was about to begin. I had spent the morning completing final preparations with Patricia Chen, reviewing legal documents one last time, and confirming that all financial transfers had been processed successfully. The stock certificates that made me the owner of Sterling Industries were locked in my briefcase, along with comprehensive operational plans that would reshape every aspect of how the company functioned. After months of careful planning and strategic patience, the moment had finally arrived to confront Robert Sterling with the reality of his new situation. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was walking through offices I now owned, past employees who didn't yet know they were about to get the leadership they deserved, toward a confrontation with a man who had underestimated me so completely that he had no idea what was coming. Robert had spent years dismissing my expertise, ignoring my proposals, and treating me like an inconvenience he had to tolerate because I was married to his son. He was about to discover that the cheap Mexican girl he had humiliated at his dinner table now controlled his entire professional legacy. Robert's secretary, Helen Morrison, looked up as I approached her desk outside his office. Helen had worked for Sterling Industries for over 20 years and had watched the company evolve from a small family business into a regional leader in industrial systems. She had also watched Robert's management style become increasingly rigid and resistant to change, though she was far too professional to express her concerns openly. "Good afternoon, Sofia," Helen said with genuine warmth. "Mr. Sterling is just finishing up a phone call with a vendor. He should be available in a few minutes if you'd like to wait." I settled into one of the leather chairs in the reception area, using the time to center myself and review the key points I needed to communicate during what would undoubtedly be the most difficult conversation of my professional life. Through Robert's partially open door, I could hear him negotiating with a supplier about delivery schedules, his voice carrying the confident authority of someone who believed he was in complete control of his business environment. The conversation revealed something important about Robert's current state of mind. He was pushing for delayed payment terms and extended delivery schedules, trying to manage cash flow challenges that weren't immediately obvious to casual observers, but were consistent with the financial pressures Patricia had described. Robert was operating under more stress than he was letting on, which might actually work in my favor during the upcoming confrontation. When Helen signaled that Robert was ready to see me, I walked into his office carrying the briefcase that contained documents that would change both of our lives permanently. Robert's office was exactly what you'd expect from someone who had built a successful company through decades of hard work. Expensive furniture that projected authority, awards and certifications that demonstrated professional achievement, family, photos that humanized the corporate environment, and windows that provided panoramic views of the industrial district where Sterling Industries had established its reputation. Robert looked up from his desk with the distracted expression of someone who had been dealing with challenging problems all day and wasn't particularly eager to take on additional complications. His greeting was polite but perfunctory, the kind of acknowledgement he might give to any employee who needed his attention for routine business matters. "Sofia, what can I do for you? I hope this won't take long. I'm trying to wrap up some vendor negotiations before the weekend." I took the seat across from his desk, placing my briefcase carefully beside my chair and meeting his eyes directly. "Robert, I need to discuss something important with you about Sterling Industries. It's going to require your complete attention, and it's going to fundamentally change your understanding of the company's ownership structure." Robert's expression shifted slightly, moving from distracted politeness to cautious attention. He had spent enough years in business to recognize when a conversation was about to become significantly more serious than its opening suggested. "Ownership. Structure?" he repeated. "Sofia, I'm not sure what you're talking about, but Sterling Industries is a family business. The ownership structure is straightforward and hasn't changed in years." I opened my briefcase and withdrew the first set of documents, placing them on Robert's desk where he could see them clearly. "Actually, Robert, the ownership structure changed dramatically this week. I've purchased all outstanding shares of Sterling Industries, making me the sole owner of the company effective immediately." The silence that followed was profound and telling. Robert stared at the documents without touching them, his face cycling through expressions of confusion, disbelief, and growing anger. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight with controlled emotion. "That's impossible. You don't have the resources to purchase Sterling Industries, and the existing shareholders would never sell to you without consulting me first." I reached into my briefcase and withdrew additional documentation, including copies of the purchase agreements that had been executed earlier in the week. The shareholders sold their holdings to me at fair market value based on current company valuations. Your 18% stake was purchased for $8. $2 million, David's 12% for $5. $4 million, and your wife's 2% for $900,000. All transactions were completed legally and with proper documentation. Robert's hands were shaking slightly as he picked up the purchase agreements and began reading through them. I watched his face as he processed the information, seeing the moment when he realized that the signatures were genuine and the transactions were legitimate. His carefully maintained composure began to crack as the full implications became clear. "This is insane," he said, his voice rising with each word. "You can't just buy a company out from under its founder. There are procedures, notifications, legal requirements. You can't ambush someone like this." "All legal requirements have been met," I replied calmly. "The stock purchases were conducted through existing option agreements that you signed during the 2020 financial crisis. Those agreements specifically authorized the transactions that were completed this week, and they were executed according to the terms you originally approved. I could see Robert's mind racing as he tried to remember the details of agreements he had signed during one of the most stressful periods in Sterling Industries' history. The 2020 crisis had forced him to make financial decisions quickly, accepting capital injections and equity arrangements that he might not have agreed to under normal circumstances. The 2020 agreements were emergency measures, Robert said, his voice becoming defensive. They were never intended to be used for a hostile takeover by someone with no business experience or industry knowledge. This was the moment I had been preparing for, the point where Robert would try to diminish my qualifications and dismiss my authority based on his preconceptions about my capabilities. I reached into my briefcase and withdrew the comprehensive operational analysis that I had been developing over the past months. Robert, I have 15 years of engineering experience in industrial systems, including 5 years specifically, focused on HVAC and refrigeration applications. I have an MBA in Operations Management from Portland State University, completed while working full-time at Sterling Industries. I have detailed knowledge of every aspect of this company's operations, from client relationships to vendor management to employee satisfaction metrics. I placed the operational analysis on his desk, its thickness and professional presentation making it impossible to dismiss as amateur work. More importantly, I have comprehensive plans for addressing every operational deficiency that has been preventing Sterling Industries from reaching its potential. Plans that you've been rejecting for years despite their clear benefits. Robert's anger was now competing with curiosity as he flipped through the pages of analysis and recommendations. Despite his emotional state, he was still businessman enough to recognize thorough professional work when he saw it. The documents I had prepared were more comprehensive than anything he had produced recently, and they addressed problems he knew were real, even if he had been unwilling to acknowledge them publicly. "Where did you get the money for this?" Robert asked, his tone shifting from anger to confusion. "Sofia, you're a middle management employee at an industrial company. You don't have millions of dollars to spend on stock purchases." I had expected this question and was prepared to provide the explanation that would complete Robert's understanding of how dramatically he had misjudged my situation. The funds came from a trust established by my uncle, Carlos Martinez, who was a successful investor in Los Angeles. Uncle Carlos had been quietly acquiring Sterling Industries stock for several years as part of his investment portfolio. Robert's face went completely white as I continued the explanation. Uncle Carlos believed that Sterling Industries had enormous potential that wasn't being realized under current management. He accumulated a controlling interest in the company and left that ownership to me, along with detailed analysis of operational improvements that would dramatically increase profitability. The mention of Carlos Martinez clearly meant something to Robert, though he was struggling to process the connection between the investment purchases he had been aware of and the revelation that those purchases were connected to his daughter-in-law. His breathing was becoming more rapid and shallow as the full scope of the situation became clear. "Carlos Martinez was your uncle?" Robert asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The investor who provided capital during our cash flow crisis?" "Yes. Uncle Carlos saw potential in Sterling Industries that you've been unable or unwilling to develop. He believed that with proper leadership and strategic investment, this company could become a regional industry leader instead of a struggling, traditional manufacturer." Robert stood up abruptly, pacing behind his desk with the agitated energy of someone whose entire worldview is being dismantled in real time. "This is a conspiracy. You've been planning this for months, maybe years. You married David to get inside information about the company, developed relationships with employees to undermine my authority, and manipulated your way into a position where you could destroy everything I've built." I remained seated, maintaining the calm demeanor that had served me well throughout my career at Sterling Industries. Robert's accusations were both predictable and revealing. He couldn't accept that his own decisions had created the circumstances. that made this transition necessary, so he was attributing my success to deception and manipulation rather than competence and preparation. Robert, I married David because I love him. I joined Sterling Industries because I wanted to contribute to the family business and help it succeed. I developed the operational improvements because I saw problems that had practical solutions. Everything I've done has been focused on making Sterling Industries more successful, more profitable, and more sustainable for the long term. I gestured toward the documents spread across his desk. The conspiracy you're talking about is actually just professional competence, applied consistently over an extended period. Uncle Carlos invested in Sterling Industries because he believed in its potential. I'm exercising ownership rights because you've been preventing that potential from being realized. Robert stopped pacing and turned to face me directly, his expression a mixture of rage and desperation that revealed how completely unprepared he had been for this conversation. Sofia, you can't do this. Sterling Industries is my life's work. I built this company from nothing, created jobs for hundreds of people, established relationships with clients throughout the region. You can't just take that away because you think you know better. I'm not taking anything away, I replied. I'm providing the leadership that Sterling Industries needs to reach its full potential. The company you built is impressive, but it's been stagnating under management that refuses to adapt to changing market conditions. I pulled out the financial analysis that Tom Chen had prepared, showing 3 years of declining profitability and market share. Robert, Sterling Industries has lost 6 major clients in the past 18 months because we couldn't provide the services they requested. We've had employee turnover rates approaching 60% in some departments because people are frustrated with outdated equipment and inefficient processes. We've missed opportunities for profitable contracts because you've refused to invest in capabilities that our competitors consider standard. Robert stared at the financial data, and I could see him recognizing trends that he had been trying to ignore or rationalize. His silence stretched for several long minutes as he processed information that contradicted his narrative about external forces causing problems that were actually internal and solvable. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow with defeat. What happens now? Do you just fire me and take over my office? This was the moment I had been most concerned about. The point where Robert's reaction would determine whether the transition could be handled with dignity or would devolve into the kind of hostile confrontation that would damage relationships and company morale. I had prepared for multiple scenarios, but I was hoping for the one that would allow Robert to maintain his reputation and self-respect. Robert, I'm prepared to offer you several options. You can resign as CEO and accept a consulting position that would allow you to maintain involvement in client relationships and strategic planning. You can stay on as a senior advisor with reduced responsibilities but significant input into company direction. Or you can retire with a comprehensive severance package that recognizes your contributions to building Sterling Industries. Robert's expression shifted as he realized that I wasn't planning to humiliate him or destroy his professional reputation. The offer of dignified alternatives seemed to catch him off guard, as if he had been expecting vindictive treatment that would match the dismissive way he had treated me. "Why would you offer me any role at all?" he asked. "You obviously think I'm incompetent and standing in the way of progress." "I think you're a talented businessman who built something impressive but lost the ability to see what it could become," I replied honestly. "Sterling Industries succeeded because of your vision and hard work. I want it to continue succeeding, and that's more likely to happen if we can find a way to combine your experience with operational improvements that address current market conditions." Robert was quiet for a long time, staring out his office, windows at the industrial district where he had spent decades building his company. When he finally turned back to me, his expression was complex, angry and hurt, but also thoughtful in ways that suggested he was beginning to process the situation more rationally. "I need time to think about this," he said finally. "This is the biggest shock of my professional life, and I can't make decisions about my future while I'm still trying to understand what just happened." "Of course. Take the weekend to consider your options. We can meet again on Monday to discuss how you'd like to proceed." Robert nodded slowly, then asked the question I had been expecting. "Does David know about this?" David has been fully informed about my plans and supports my decision to acquire Sterling Industries. He's also planning to resign from the company to avoid any appearance of nepotism and to pursue career opportunities that align better with his long-term goals. And the rest of my family? This was the most delicate part of the entire situation. Patricia Sterling was going to be devastated by the changes, not just because of their impact on Robert, but because of what they represented about family relationships and loyalty. David's sister Jennifer would be confused and probably angry about developments that affected her father's legacy and her family's financial security. David and I will handle family communications together. We want to make sure everyone understands that these decisions are based on business considerations and legal ownership rights, not personal animosity or family conflicts. Robert laughed bitterly. "Sofia, you just bought my company and removed me from leadership. My wife is going to see that as the ultimate personal attack, regardless of how you frame it. My daughter is going to think you manipulated your way into the family to destroy everything I built." He wasn't wrong about the family dynamics, and I had been dreading those conversations since I first decided to move forward with the acquisition. But I also knew that maintaining the status quo would have been more damaging to everyone involved, including Robert himself. "Robert, Sterling Industries was failing under your leadership. Not because you're a bad person or because you don't care about the company, but because you refuse to adapt to changes that were necessary for long-term survival. If I hadn't intervened, you would have lost the company anyway, probably within 2 years, and the failure would have been much more public and damaging to your reputation." I gathered my documents and prepared to leave, but there was one more thing I needed to address before ending this conversation. "Robert, I want you to know that I never wanted it to come to this. I spent 2 years trying to work within your system, presenting solutions that would have prevented most of the problems we're facing now. You dismissed those solutions, and you dismissed me, and eventually I realized that hoping for gradual change was just enabling continued deterioration." Robert was staring at his desk, not meeting my eyes, but I could tell he was listening carefully to everything I was saying. "The comment about me being cheap at your birthday dinner for me was the final confirmation that you would never see me as someone whose opinions deserved serious consideration. But that comment also motivated me to stop waiting for your approval and start using the authority I actually possessed." I stood up, briefcase in hand, and headed toward the door. "Robert, I hope you'll consider one of the positions I offered. Sterling Industries will be stronger with your experience and relationships, and I believe we can find a way to work together that benefits everyone involved." As I reached the door, Robert called out one final question. "Sofia, how long have you known about the inheritance and the stock ownership?" I turned back to face him. "I've known about Uncle Carlos's investment strategy since early this year, but I didn't fully understand the extent of his Sterling Industries holdings until after your dinner table comment motivated me to take action. If you had treated me with respect and listened to my professional recommendations, none of this would have been necessary." I left Robert's office and walked through the Sterling Industries facility one final time as an employee rather than as an owner. The weekend would give him time to process what had happened and decide how he wanted to handle the transition. Monday morning would begin a new chapter for Sterling Industries, one that would finally realize the potential that Uncle Carlos had seen and that I had been preparing to unlock. The following Monday morning arrived with unseasonable warmth for November in Portland. I had spent the weekend in detailed conversations with David about family dynamics, with Patricia Chen about legal protocols, and with key employees about implementation timelines for the operational changes that would transform Sterling Industries. By 8 a.m., I was ready to address the company as its new owner and leader. The all-hands meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. in the main assembly area, where I would announce the ownership change and outline my plans for the company's future. Robert had called me Sunday evening to inform me that he would not be accepting any of the positions I had offered, instead choosing to retire immediately with the severance package I had proposed. His decision was disappointing, but not surprising. His pride had been too damaged by the circumstances to allow him to continue working at Sterling Industries under my leadership. As employees gathered for the meeting, I could see curiosity and concern in their faces. Unscheduled all-hands meetings usually meant bad news, layoffs, contract losses, or other developments that would negatively impact job security. Many of the people in that room had been frustrated by operational problems and management decisions for years, but they also worried about changes that might make their situations worse rather than better. I began the meeting by introducing myself properly for the first time since joining Sterling Industries 2 years earlier. Good morning, everyone. For those who don't know me well, I'm Sofia Martinez, and as of Friday afternoon, I became the owner of Sterling Industries through the acquisition of all outstanding company stock. The reaction was immediate and intense. Some employees looked shocked, others looked confused, and a few looked genuinely excited by the possibility of new leadership. I continued quickly to provide context and reassurance. I want to assure everyone that this ownership change is not related to financial problems or plans for downsizing. Sterling Industries is profitable and will continue operating at current employment levels. The change in leadership is focused on implementing operational improvements that will make us more competitive and more successful in the long term. I spent the next 30 minutes outlining the specific changes that would be implemented immediately. Technology upgrades that employees had been requesting for years, process improvements that would make their jobs easier and more efficient, safety enhancements that would reduce workplace injuries, and training programs that would provide professional development opportunities. The response from employees was overwhelmingly positive. Janet Rodriguez, who had been frustrated by rejected technology proposals for years, actually started crying when I announced that we would be implementing comprehensive system upgrades within 60 days. Tom Chen looked relieved when I described financial management improvements that would provide department managers with better data for decision-making. Maria Santos smiled broadly as I outlined employee retention and development programs that would recognize and reward the contributions of people who had been undervalued for too long. The most powerful moment came when Danny Morales, the technician who had been injured because of equipment failure, asked about safety improvements and equipment replacement schedules. I was able to tell him that we would be implementing comprehensive safety upgrades and replacing aging equipment according to manufacturer recommendations rather than deferring maintenance for cost reasons. Danny, your injury should never have happened, and it won't happen again under my leadership. We're going to invest in equipment and procedures that prioritize worker safety as well as operational efficiency. The meeting concluded with a question and answer session that revealed how ready employees were for positive change. People who had been quietly frustrated for years were suddenly able to voice their concerns and hear specific solutions that addressed their professional needs. The energy in the room was electric with possibility and excitement about the future. Over the following weeks, Sterling Industries transformed more rapidly and comprehensively than I had dared to hope. The technology implementations proceeded smoothly, with employees embracing new systems that made their jobs easier and more effective. Client relationships improved as we began offering services and capabilities that had been requested for years but never provided. Employee retention improved dramatically as people realized they were working for a company that valued their contributions and invested in their success. The most satisfying changes were in the relationships between departments and the overall company culture. Instead of competing for limited resources and attention, employees began collaborating on solutions that benefited everyone. Instead of having their expertise dismissed or ignored, technical specialists were consulted on decisions that affected their areas of responsibility. Instead of feeling like expendable resources, workers were treated as valuable team members whose insights contributed to company success. 6 months after the ownership transition, Sterling Industries achieved the highest quarterly profitability in company history. We had regained 3 of the major clients we had lost under Robert's leadership and had acquired 4 new significant contracts based on our enhanced capabilities and competitive pricing. Employee satisfaction surveys showed dramatic improvements across all categories, with particular increases in job satisfaction, workplace safety, and professional development opportunities. The transformation validated everything Uncle Carlos had believed about Sterling Industries' potential and everything I had tried to communicate to Robert about necessary changes. More importantly, it demonstrated that effective leadership could unlock capabilities that had always existed but had been suppressed by resistance to innovation and change. The family dynamics remained complicated, as I had expected. Patricia Sterling struggled to understand how her son's wife had acquired her husband's company, and she interpreted the situation as a betrayal of family trust rather than a business decision based on operational necessity. Jennifer Sterling was confused and angry about changes that affected her father's legacy, though she gradually came to understand that Sterling Industries was more successful under my leadership than it had been under Robert's. David's role in the situation became crucial for maintaining family relationships. He consistently supported my decisions while also helping his parents understand that the changes were motivated by business considerations rather than personal animosity. His willingness to give up his own position at Sterling Industries helped demonstrate that we weren't motivated by self-interest or family politics. Robert himself remained distant and resentful for several months after his retirement, but eventually began to acknowledge that Sterling Industries was performing better under my leadership than it had during his final years as CEO. The financial security provided by his stock sale allowed him to pursue other interests without the stress of managing a struggling company, and he gradually came to appreciate the freedom that retirement provided. The most meaningful recognition came from employees who had watched Sterling Industries struggle for years and then flourish under leadership that recognized their value and expertise. Workers who had been planning to leave for better opportunities decided to stay and contribute to the company's growth. Technical specialists who had felt undervalued began taking pride in their contributions to innovative projects. Supervisors who had been frustrated by resource limitations were able to provide their teams with the tools and support necessary for excellent performance. 1 year after acquiring Sterling Industries, I received a letter from Danny Morales, the technician whose injury had crystallized my determination to make safety a priority. He wrote to thank me for equipment upgrades and safety improvements that had prevented several potential accidents in his department. More importantly, he thanked me for listening to employee concerns and implementing changes that demonstrated genuine care for worker welfare. Mrs. Martinez, his letter concluded, working for Sterling Industries used to feel like fighting a losing battle against problems that never got solved. Now, it feels like being part of a team that's building something impressive and sustainable. Thank you for giving us leadership that matches the quality of work we've always been capable of producing. That letter represented everything I had hoped to accomplish by exercising the authority Uncle Carlos had provided. Sterling Industries had always employed talented, dedicated people who deserved leadership that recognized their potential and invested in their success. By replacing management that had been preventing progress with approaches that enabled excellence, we had created an organization that benefited everyone involved: employees, clients, vendors, and the broader community. The transformation also vindicated Uncle Carlos's investment philosophy and strategic planning. He had identified a company with excellent potential that was being held back by outdated management practices, and he had positioned me to implement changes that would unlock that potential when the time was right. His patient approach and comprehensive preparation had created an opportunity for meaningful impact that extended far beyond financial returns. Standing in my office 18 months after the confrontation with Robert, looking out at the Sterling, Industries facility where nearly 300 people now worked in an environment that supported their success, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. The girl from East Portland who had been called cheap at a family dinner had become the leader of a thriving company that contributed to economic growth, environmental sustainability, and worker prosperity throughout the Pacific Northwest. The transformation hadn't been easy, and it had required difficult decisions that affected family relationships and personal loyalties. But it had also demonstrated that effective leadership could create positive change that benefited everyone involved, and that patient preparation combined with strategic action could overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable. Most importantly, it had proven that Uncle Carlos had been right about potential that others couldn't see or wouldn't acknowledge. Sterling Industries had always been capable of excellence. It just needed leadership that was willing to invest in that excellence rather than preventing it from developing. The lesson wasn't about revenge or vindication, though those elements had certainly been satisfying. The real lesson was about recognizing potential, preparing thoroughly, and having the courage to act decisively when the moment for change arrived. Sometimes the people others dismiss as insignificant are the ones with the power to create transformation that benefits everyone involved. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.